Hello, my name is Alexander Prairie. I am the president of Atheists United, and this is the fourth Sunday of the month where we meet in Marina Del Rey. And Atheists United is an organization dedicated to separation of church and state, providing an atmosphere where non-believers can come together and feel comfortable, and also to promote the understanding of atheists through a public that gets a lot of misinformation. Today, our speaker is going to be Dr. Stephen Morris.
Thank you. I am an atheist. I have been an atheist for many years, and many of you in the audience today can say the same. And for some of us, it is rather difficult to understand, after all these many years, how people can feel comfortable with their religions, or indeed how they can have been attracted to their religions in the first place. After all, according to most religions, this world around us was created specifically for the use of men. Women come along a little later, but basically for the use of men. And yet, when we look at the world today, we find that it's hardly seem to be designed as a very convenient place for the human race. A great fraction of humanity goes to bed hungry at night with no certain idea of where they will be getting their next meal in the daytime. The world is full of dangers, needless diseases, and of course, in the end, death. Most people live lives of desperation and face many hardships throughout their years on this earth. For a planet that was supposedly designed specifically for us, it doesn't seem to have been designed very well. Religion does not even have the excuse of there only being one religion in this world. There are thousands of religions. They all contradict each other. And indeed, religions themselves tend to be self-contradictory. Even within one religion and in one set of holy books, one finds massive inconsistencies. Is murder good or is it bad? Well, most religious texts give you a clear answer. The answer is yes and no. And you're allowed to choose depending on what the situation happens to be. All of these religions, for all the differences that they have among themselves, do, however, say one thing. They say that they are the one true religion, and all the other 1,000 religions are false. And they try to penalize those who dare to believe in some other religion as far as their strength can manage. For all these reasons, we as atheists consider religion to be a mistake, something not worth spending time on. It is a waste of effort. And we consign the idea of gods to the category of the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus, perhaps pleasant to believe in some ways, but not true. For all this, we find that most people around us remain hag-ridden with religion. Rather than abandoning religion, they seem to embrace it. And I think it's worth our while to try and understand why people are comfortable with their religions and what it is in religions that satisfies them. What urge in humans does religion satisfy? Well, I think one of the primary things that religion serves is the human sense of conceit and self-importance. Now, you might actually think that's a rather odd thing to say because, after all, a lot of religions are based on the idea of praying to some god and saying, oh, we're not worthy, you are so great, we grovel before you. And yet, in many ways, despite this, religions are based on conceit. And True, they like to make a great deal of their humility. In fact, in some ways, they boast of their humility and are proud of how humble they happen to be, which is a rather strange contradiction and a rather difficult stunt to pull off. After all, what does religion claim? It claims to have the answers to everything. Religions claim they've got the answer. Well, this is certainly an overwhelming amount of conceit to try and say something like this. Of course, it's easy enough to see how religions might arise to fulfill this sort of need. After all, thousands of years ago, our ancestors were faced with many of the same questions that puzzle us today. How do we know what's right and wrong? Where did the universe come from? Why does the sun rise in the east and set in the west? These are all profound questions, and thousands of years ago, nobody had an answer. But rather than say, I don't know, nobody knows. Perhaps for some of these questions, nobody will ever know the answer. Rather than being satisfied with that, people invent answers. There is a human need to be certain of knowledge. Not necessarily correct knowledge, but there's a human need to be certain. Thousands of years ago, ignorant shepherds came up with their answers to how the universe was brought into being, and it was probably the best that they could do. This then leads them with a shortcut to certainty, but not a shortcut to truth. We now realize that many of their answers were profoundly wrong. Religion indeed has often been wrong, but it has never been uncertain. And, and this is one of the conceits of religion, to say that they know everything. I think that's where a lot of religious belief comes from. Another way in which religions tend to be conceited is that they say that the gods are profoundly interested in what us humans are doing. That this is, that humans are central to the universe, and that God or the gods is desperately anxious about us. It's hard to see why the gods should be that anxious about us, even if if the gods do happen to exist. And yet that is the feeling that people have, that when faced with this uncertainty, that the gods must care about them. Sigmund Freud, earlier in this century, wrote a book about religion in which, in a very unsentimental way, he analyzed religion in a psychological sense. And he put this in a book which he called The Future of an Illusion. And this is one passage that I think is very true about religion. Critics persist in calling deeply religious a person who confesses to a sense of man's insignificance and impotence in face of the universe, although it is not this feeling that constitutes the essence of religious emotion, but rather the next step, the reaction to it, which seeks a remedy against this feeling. He who goes no further, he who humbly acquiesces in the insignificant part man plays in the universe, is, on the contrary, irreligious in the truest sense of the word. Religion tells us that we are important, and that feeds our sense of conceit. We can see this throughout history. When Shakespeare wrote of Julius Caesar, "When beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes." He was merely echoing a common superstition that when some prince died, you would see their spirit departing for heaven in the form of a comet. We now realize that comets are very large astronomical objects of great interest, and we also realize now that most of the princes of history were self-centered scoundrels, and we'd have been better off without them. Nonetheless, the feeling is that the comets are a response to the importance of princes. Bertrand Russell, a British philosopher, had a very wry sense of humor, and he discussed the same sort of self-importance in the following passage. If you pass in a train a field containing grazing cows, you may sometimes see them running away in terror as the train passes. The cow, if it were religious, would argue, everything in my own desires and hopes and fears has reference to myself. Hence, by induction, I conclude that everything in the universe has reference to myself. This noisy train, therefore, intends to do me either good or harm. I cannot suppose it intends to do me good, since it comes in such a terrifying form, and therefore, as a prudent cow, I shall endeavor to escape it. If you were to explain to this metaphysical ruminant that the train has no intention of leaving the rails, that it is totally indifferent to the fate of the cow, the poor beast would be bewildered by anything so unnatural. The train that wishes her neither well nor ill would seem more cold and more abysmally horrifying than a train that wished her ill. Just this has happened with human beings. We feel that everything in the world has a purpose in relationship to us. We're very self-centered about that, and when things seem to occur that just seem to happen, we tend to fill in a religious explanation to make us feel better about it. I always find it rather curious to think that in religions, religions say that God needs us to think in certain ways, God needs us to do certain things, and that other religious people have to force us to do those things and believe those things in order to make God happy. I think this is a bit of an insult to God's importance and to God's power. After all, if God wants something done, let God do it himself. He doesn't need us weak, puny little humans to do things. And yet, it fulfills our conceit to say, well, I'm just doing God's will. And we are all here on the earth for a purpose, even if we don't know what that purpose is. I find this gives a very peculiar image of what God must be like. After all, the idea that you or I have to behave in a certain way, or God will send us to hell as punishment, strikes me as very peculiar. For example, suppose that I want my pet dog to learn how to fetch the newspaper for me. I could fetch the paper very well myself. But suppose I demand the dog fetch the paper for me, and I spend endless hours forcing it to do this, and I beat the dog to make sure it tries to do this. Does this reflect well on me, that I would make this dog's life miserable just to do something that I could do perfectly well myself? And yet that is the image that we have of how God behaves to us. And certainly, suppose that dog couldn't figure out how to bring in the newspaper. It either wasn't intelligent enough or just for some reason couldn't do it. Suppose I then said, well, you're not going to do it? And I pour gasoline on the dog and set it on fire. What sort of person would I be judged? And yet that is how we picture Jehovah and how we picture many of the other gods that have plagued humans. Thank you, thank you. In the Bronze Age, to give you an example of this, in the Bronze Age, a bunch of tribal chieftains from Greece, the Isles of Greece, decided they would lay siege to some remote fort of the Akkadian Empire. And so they traveled over there, and for several years they laid siege to it. And eventually, after spending a few years plundering the neighboring coastline, managed to bring this fort down. Now, these people, it turns out, the Greeks, managed to convince themselves that the gods of heaven were immensely interested in this little conflict. In fact, the conflict was of no importance whatever, except that it gave us a remarkable book from the Bronze Age, which we call the Iliad. And in this Iliad, we find that, according to these people, the gods were immensely interested in what they were doing. The gods chose sides, with Aphrodite on one side and other gods, Apollo on some other side. And they would fight for the different sides, and when there was a lull in the battle, they'd stand around and chat. Of course, you can now point out that this was really quite preposterous, that these sort of gods do not exist, and even if they had existed, why would they care about these people? I'm sure it just flattered their descendants enormously to think that their ancestors of only a few generations ago were able to converse with gods, and the gods really cared about them all that much. Well, nobody believes in Zeus and Hera and all the rest of them, so you're free to point this out. However, in this day and age, you are not so free to point out the same absurdities for the behavior of some ancient sheep herders in the Middle East, in the Sinai Desert, who followed essentially the same path and whose writings come to essentially the same conclusions. In the last few centuries, science has been able to understand the world around us much better than all these ancient texts were ever able to do. And science has confirmed that humans are not all that important in the nature of the universe. That this planet, it turns out, is not the center of the universe. It is one of several stars, several planets that orbit around our sun. In fact, it's not even the biggest of the planets. And that our sun is a sort of middle-aged average star surrounded by billions of other stars in our galaxy, and that galaxy is surrounded by billions of other galaxies throughout the universe. Far from being the central aspect of the universe, we're tucked off in one corner. Now, how should we respond as atheists to the fact that in reality, humans are not central to the universe? Well, I myself am not going to burst into the tears simply because the Andromeda Galaxy doesn't care whether I live or die. And it's true the Andromeda Galaxy doesn't care, but really, is this all that important? We are important to ourselves. Humans matter because we form a community that is trying to live worthwhile lives. The idea that we have to waste our time praising gods and running errands for them strikes me as very bizarre. We have, after all, a few decades of life on this earth. Don't we have more than enough to do trying to make our fellow human beings happy? Well, okay. Thank you. We will not run out of work to do in trying to make this world a better place for our fellow human beings. That is what we should be doing, and not spending our time on our knees telling God that he's just as great as he seems to think, at least according to the religions. In some ways, the gods are our parents magnified and blown up. When our earliest memories are of our parents, sometimes doing us good, sometimes it seems doing us ill, but throughout it all, we knew that in some way our parents cared about us and were running our lives for our benefit. Our gods are exactly the same, and I think that our idea of religion comes from hoping that the gods will do the same things for us that our parents did when we were children. In fact, many religions, the gods are our ancestors, and ancestor worship is central to many religions. This is true even when things don't go our way. For example, in Genesis, Adam and Eve may not have much cared for the changes that Jehovah came up with after they ate the fruit, but they must have been flattered that God was going through all of this effort, changing the machinery of the universe, just to teach them a lesson. It is a measure, hell, as much as heaven, is a measure of human vanity. One aspect of religion that is very peculiar is prayer. The idea that if you pray to your gods, that the gods will change the universe to suit you a bit better. I've always found this a very curious idea, that you could tell God, oh, by the way, I need this, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen, and God would look down and say, well, I was running the universe my way, but I see your point. I guess I'll change my mind about this, and I'll do things now that you've corrected me about it. This is a very peculiar attitude towards the Almighty. Surely the Almighty already knows what you need or want and doesn't need you to tell them. In any culture, there are always a few people who seem to be particularly good at prayers or are particularly spiritual towards a certain religion. And as religions get more complicated, most societies make the following deal with such people and say, well, you seem to be so good at this, why don't you take over some of the responsibilities of keeping us in well with the powers that be, and we'll let you take care of that so we can go on living our lives. This is a mistake, but it's a mistake that most religions have made because this is the start of the priestly caste in various societies. The professional religionists who form a certain class and spend all their time keeping track of the Almighty and making sure that things work out the way they ought to for their little group of followers. We actually have a record of how one religion managed to do this, and in fact we can find this in the Old Testament. If you actually bother to read the Old Testament, and I find not a great many believers do, but I find it fascinating, during the reign of King Josiah, one of the temple priests, priest Hilkiah, approached the king one day and said, I've just found this ancient scroll written by Moses himself in the Temple of Solomon. I can't imagine how anybody has missed it for so long. And of course the king, being I think a little bit ignorant and easily managed, wanted to know what this revelation from Moses said. Well, what it said was essentially that priests are very, very important people, and that there are all sorts of rituals and arcane rites and all sorts of restrictions that the Jews had never had to face before. But not to worry, the priests would keep track of it all as long as they could be well kept. This document was undoubtedly just a forgery, probably written by the priest Hilkiah himself, but it had far-reaching effects because this text, in all probability, became the second law to the Jews, and in fact that is how we know it today, although we know it in Greek as Deuteronomy. And it is that book in the Bible that contains many of the really picky, outrageous little rites and rituals that the Jews are expected to follow. I think that this is true for really all religions. It is just a general behavior of religions to become more and more complicated, more and more arcane as the answers that they produce become less and less satisfactory. And that this is simply inevitable for all religions. I think this is very true of the Jewish and Christian religions. If you look at the earliest books in the Bible, they didn't have priests. They had some leaders and prophets like Moses, for example, but they didn't have priests. Then this Hilkiah comes along and comes up with all his rules and regulations. By the time of the Roman occupation 2,000 years ago, this had become so complicated that many Jews were simply abandoning the Jewish religion as just being overwhelming. What should happen but that a reformer came along by the name of Joshua, although that's what they called him then, we now call him Jesus, and his basic message, as far as I can tell, although people are notorious for reading into the Bible what they want to see there, but as far as I can make out, what he essentially said was, you don't need all of this. You have to believe, you have to be nice to other people, but beyond that, you don't need all these rituals. Well, it turned into a religion, Christianity, and what happened to that religion that said you don't need rules and regulations? Rules and regulations, all over the place. The Eastern Orthodox version of Christianity looks down its nose at the Roman Catholic religion for its paucity of ceremony. Doesn't have enough ceremonies to suit the Eastern Orthodox. But I find the Roman Catholic religion is more than suffocating enough in all of the liturgy and all of the rules that hardly seem to be necessary. At the end of the Middle Ages, a lot of Christians agreed, people like Martin Luther, for example, and they said, we don't need all of this stuff. Every man his own minister. Sorry, women don't count. I didn't do it. Every man his own minister. You can pray and you can read the Bible. That's all that you need. You don't need a bunch of priests because they don't know any more than you do about Christianity. And the Protestant religions got their start. What did the Protestant religions do? Rules and regulations. They now have ceremonies where everything runs on schedule. You sing your 4 prayers or your 4 religious songs every service. Everything runs according to schedule. The evangelicals have recently tried to break away from that, but only to fall into the same basic mistake of having priests. Well, they don't call them priests, they call them ministers, who try to tell them and everybody else how to run their lives. So it is conceit that feeds a lot of religious feeling in this world.